I just hit the record
Thanks.
button on my end, yeah.
And we're live. Thanks, Andy. So hello, everyone, from my side to the next Keptn community meeting. Today we want to have one of the first actual working meetings where we want to discuss some future use case that we want to cover with Keptn. So one of the three major use cases of Keptn, which are continuous delivery, continuous operation, and also like automated quality gate validation. We've worked hard on the vision of the next generation of the quality gates use case, and we kind of wrote down our thoughts around that use case and wanted to verify with you if this use case actually meets your needs, if you would want to use this use case as we described it, or if there is something in there that doesn't work for you at all. And to that end, I'd like to go through the document, maybe chapter by chapter, section by section, and just gather the feedback that you have regarding the specific topics. So maybe it's just as a little a frame or our thought process around this. So this will actually be part of the version 0.6, which we are working on right now. We might not implement all of the details that are in there right now, but at least this is the direction that we're headed. And we want to know right away if this, if we need to consider things that we haven't thought of yet, and that is actually why we want to have this working session right now. So are there any questions up front before we get started with the content?
No, all good. Thanks for the focus here and for giving us the chance to actually give you the feedback. So well appreciated.
Thanks. So for anyone that watches the recording and has a question, please reach out to us. I think the best way still is our Slack channel, and get in touch with us and just ask the questions. Or the link to the document will be in the meeting notes, and you can just leave comments. And as Hendrik already left some comments, unfortunately he couldn't be with us in this meeting because of traveling. But I will pick up his comments and guide you through what he was asking and what the answer to that question was. Then let's get started with the use case. So the scenario that we are focusing on here is that we often got the request that some companies and customers want to use Keptn in all its glory, but they kind of want to have they don't want to go all in right away. So they maybe want to keep some of their existing tools that they have right now, for example, for the deployment or for testing, but are very attracted by the quality gates use case that they can define service level objectives for their services and have Keptn validate against those objectives after tests have been run or after a certain amount of live traffic has happened at the service. And so this is the scenario that you want to wrap your hand around for this session. And we want to go through how actually we define the service level objectives and how a user workflow would look like to use the Keptn quality gates. So we have 3 prerequisites that need to be met. We of course need a Keptn installation. Then for each service that you want to evaluate your we need the service level objectives for that service. And of course, we need tools that provide service level indicators. So there could be metrics like response time, and we will be there in just a second. So you need a service level indicator provider. And in our initial version, we will support both Prometheus and Dynatrace for the objectives evaluation using SLIs. So any questions to that section?
I know that Neoload, especially Hendrik, he has built extensions for Neoload also as a metric provider. Is this something that would already be, I mean, would he be able to kind of use his implementation for the new quality gates as well, or is this something where he needs to wait?
So the metric providers now work with P2Meter,
Mm-hmm.
and P2Meter is something that we will continuously re-implement, because it just does not meet our requirements for that quality gates use case anymore. So it worked well in the versions that we had now, but if we want to actually go further and support more complex scenarios, we need to adapt a few things. So while in theory the definition that Hendrik already has done, and for that matter everyone else that provided a P2Meter source, will be basically the same. So you need to come up with an implementation that pulls predefined metrics out of a third-party system.
Mm-hmm.
It could just be that the implementation might differ a little bit. So we haven't worked out all of the last details yet. So it's some of the bits and pieces that are still missing. So most likely there is some work required on the sources end to support the new version. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Next section is a brief introduction of service level objectives and indicators. And if you're familiar with Google's SRE handbook, then you already know this. So this is, and it says it here, it's inspired by the book. So there is the definition of a service level objective and a service level indicator, saying that an SLI is a quantitative measure of some aspect of the level of the service that is provided. So there is a metric that can be measured and also queried and compared to some other values of that metric. And the objective is the target value or range for that specific metric that you need to meet in order to meet the objective. And for our first throw, or for the first version, we are set out to support 5 service level indicators. And these are also, on the one hand, we've talked to a lot of people working at Dynatrace that worked with a lot of customers that actually also said us, and Andy is one of the of those people that said these 5 metrics are the most useful when evaluating the quality of a service. And the SRE handbook of Google also tells the same story. So the metrics are request latency, and this is described as the time that it takes for a service to execute or complete the task. Or it's also often referred to as response time, so how long does it take to get a response to a request. And there we are interested on the one hand in the median, so the 50th percentile, the 90th and the 95th percentile. Then for the next, these are basically 3 service level indicators that you can define objectives for later on, as we will see. The next service level indicator is throughput, so the number of requests per second that have been processed. And the 5th one is the error rate, so how many of all of the requests that have been processed produce an error. So it's a fraction. Now let's take a look at how, based on those service level indicators, you can define service level objectives. So an SLO consists of a service level indicator, a service filter that is used to uniquely identify your service in the selected SLI provider, so for example, Prometheus, and an evaluation success criteria that is dependent on the comparison strategy that you've designed. And now we will go through each section of this configuration and explain it in detail what those things mean. This is an example. And Anonymous was also Henrik before he logged in. Then he logged in. So the question that Henrik here had is that for the service filter, the project stage and service are redundant to the add resource command. That is a good point. So maybe we will get to that when we go to the process that it is for a user to actually execute the quality gates. Maybe it's too confusing right here to go into detail of that. And this one I didn't get. I also already followed up with him what he actually did mean by that. Maybe he can get back to me. A service filter, as we said before, service level objectives are defined per service. So a service filter can be used to uniquely identify a service, for example, in Prometheus or in Dynatrace. So as we follow the default process of Keptn when we execute quality gates, is that we have a Keptn project, a stage, and a service. And these three variables can be used to identify the service in a query to those SLI providers. And in addition, these three variables are inferred automatically because we already know the project's name, the stage's name, and the name of the service. But this can also be overwritten in the configuration. If for whatever reason the metrics or the SLI values need to be queried with a different value than is inferred from the project name or the service name, for example. And in addition, you can also have an ID field this could then be used, for example, to identify the Prometheus scrapes job, or for a Dynatrace example, the service ID. So this part is responsible for identifying a service in the SLI provider to only query the metrics or the SLIs for the affected service.
So, and Dirk, this is Rob. So like in the Dynatrace tags, would that be something that goes in one of those attributes? Because the tag rule is kind of, it's a whole JSON structure often.
Sure. So the way this works is that we actually wanted to have the service filters as SLI provider agnostic as possible. So we tell you the values of project, stage, service, and maybe an additional ID and maybe additional parameters in the future if we find the need for that. And then have an evaluation service that has kind of a plugin or modules mechanism for each SLI provider that is then responsible for translating the filter properties to a proper query for that specific tool. And if you now say for Dynatrace, this is the case that this is a complex JSON structure out of tags that consist of those values, then it would be in the responsibility of that Dynatrace module of the evaluation service to map these properties to the proper query to get the right SLIs.
Okay, so is there some other file then, like, just using that Dynatrace provider example, so is there some other file that gets defined to say this stage and service maps to this tag structure? Or I guess I'm just trying to visualize where you actually do that, or how, or if you.
I think we probably have an opinionated approach where the Dynatrace source implementation assumes that certain tags are a given, right? And therefore then queries the Dynatrace API, assuming that there's a project tag on it or a stage tag or a service. I think we will probably have, and Dick, correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume I think we assume certain tags to be present, and we just take these project, stage, and service names and then kind of convert it into a specific query for specific Dynatrace tags.
Yeah.
Okay. So okay.
That's it.
All right. Okay. Yeah, you can continue. That's fine. Yeah. And just in one other maybe commentary, I know we weren't going through the different indicators. So this request latency, I saw that is a word that the Google handbook used versus response time. Have you found it seems like response time is a more common description than latency. Latency usually implies, a certain sort of flavor of response time. Are we going to go? Are you recommending we really start using the word latency and pushing that versus response time? I just don't know how common it is to say latency equals response time.
So what
even
you're
though I know
saying
the Google
is
handbook says it.
You're saying you think response time is more common than request latency, and you would recommend using that terminology?
I think I can look into a little bit, but I mean, I know our API uses response time. Most load testing tools use response time, and latency. I just associate with like a network latency, like the response time is slow because of like network latency, for example. But I don't usually think of like latency as being the end-to-end response time. Just when I read that word, that's all. It's just more commentary than change it.
So I don't have a personal I don't personally prefer one of those terms. If we come to the conclusion that the one is more common or more often used, then I don't have any problem switching to this terminology. Just maybe we should at least until the next community meeting finalize with which terminology we want to go. So if you can put in some time to do the research on that,
sure,
I have no problem with
not
renaming that.
Yeah, no problem.
Cool. Thanks. We had the service filter. Next is comparison strategies, as we see it here. So usually when you, that's also some of the feedback we've got. So with the first version with pedometer, we had to define thresholds, hard thresholds that are then compared against. And what we hear in the industry that this is not a common use case. The most common use case we heard out there is that you usually compare to either the previous value or like the average of a certain number of previous values, just to identify regression, for example. Otherwise, you also need to adapt the threshold multiple times to actually get it right. And this is the reason why we have the first comparison strategy that has a wonderful name of compare with previous, which does exactly that. So it fetches the SLIs for a specific service and compares with the same SLI from the previous result. And that's what it does. So if you provide a parameter of number of previous results to compare one, it only compares with the last result, which of course also means that we will save the results of the SLIs within Keptn. And for example, if you say 3, then it will just compare the current SLI value with the average of the last 3 results. If there are only 2 results, obviously with the average of the last 2 results, and so on and so forth. While this is the first strategy that we will implement, this will not be the only one. So going forward, we are happy to have also community contributions for additional comparison strategies that other companies see fit or might need.
I just have 2 comments here quickly. The option to exclude previous runs that were, let's say, that failed, because if you have a lot of failed test results, then if a new build comes in, then obviously you're always comparing it eventually with failed builds that you don't want. So kind of exclude failed test results. And the second thing that I've seen, and that's also the way we implemented it back in the days with AppMon, is that you have to have at least a minimum number of previous results. So kind of building up a quote-unquote baseline. And unless you really have, let's say, at least 3 or 5 runs, you basically cannot evaluate or cannot come up to a conclusion. So that's also why...
So it would fail?
No, it would succeed with the warning, not enough
Okay.
historical data yet. But that's in a classical scenario when you start with a new project and you have no historical results yet. You want to build up basically a baseline.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. So to your first comment, this is something we've already discussed, and we definitely want to implement in one of the coming versions. And the second point you made about that, if there is no baseline yet, that it should so the evaluation should throw a warning. We could do that, yes.
And I thought too, maybe this was baked into your number one, but you want to compare it to. I mean, I guess it's maybe it's the inverse of what Andy was saying. I guess I was thinking like I want to compare it to the last good test run, or I guess what Andy you were saying was, I have to go flag all of these runs or as bad and don't count those or something like that.
Yeah, it's the same functionality that would solve both your and Andy's solution to actually flag certain test runs to be not included in the comparison or in the evaluation.
Right.
Exactly.
And Andy, did you have a number of test runs in mind to kind of have enough history? Like, in other words, this might be, there's a default number of test runs you include, because you were trying to get like an average sampling or something like that. Was 3 sufficient? 5, 7? Did you have?
Yeah, I think we should come up with a default. And in the app Mondays it was 5, but that makes probably sense as a good best practice.
Yeah, it could just be like a default. Yeah, right.
So I think there's a question, but someone is muted. No question. Okay.
So you're saying in the first implementation, you're only going to have a compare with previous. You're not going to have just a query with fixed thresholds like we have now. We're only going to do a comparison style.
Correct.
Okay. And that's just because we're pushing. We just think people will do that more. I mean, it is more maybe an Andy thing. Like, is that kind of the feedback you've had, where people are more likely to just use? It's easier to implement this versus the fixed threshold.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think we also need a minimum, an MVP, right? And we need to focus on things that actually allow us to get to the first version. And as we all love to have obviously more capabilities in there, I think it's a great starting point.
Yeah, so we will get this with every section. So this is like really and you said the term, Andy, already. This is the plan for the MVP. So this is not the final version. This is the version where we found, with discussion with customers and other interested parties in Keptn, that they would get the most value out of if we build exactly that, and we can actually fulfill their use cases. So this is while the features may be a little bit narrow in functionality, but once we have like the end-to-end use case, it's an easy task to actually add additional comparison strategies, add additional service level indicators and that. So this is not the final version that we will have. This is the first version that we want to build.
No, totally understand. Yep. And I like the idea of strategy, right? It just gives us a framework to add more. Got it.
Cool. All right, then let's talk about the objectives. So objectives usually consists of an SLI, of course, and we have 2 values that you can specify. You can specify a value of pass, and you can specify a needs approval value. They can, of course, be both positive or negative. Depends on the SLI that you actually chose. So if you take response time, lower is better. If you take throughput, higher is better. So it really depends on the SLI that you choose. And those 2 values can be interpreted like the following. And there is actually an example that should really highlight how this works. And this is also something that Henrik asked. What I mean with beyond, if it's less or greater than those values, it really depends on if it's a positive or a negative. If positive or negative is better for a specific SLI. And let's just do it, make a walkthrough with this example. So it's compare with previous. You should only compare to the previous results. We have an SLI of request latency or response time, P90. The pass criteria is 5%, so plus 5% in that case, because there's no hyphen in front, no minus. And needs approval is 10%. And just for the sake of simplicity, let's assume that the previous evaluation of request latency P90 was 400 milliseconds. So now here we are in the next run. We run the tests, we pull the SLIs from the SLI provider, and now if we get a value that is lower than 420 milliseconds, that is actually the 400 milliseconds from before plus 5% that is defined as the pass criteria, then the result would be pass. And if the threshold for manual approval is 10%, so it's 440 milliseconds, then all of the SLI values between 420 and 440 would result in a needs approval result, which then in turn can be interpreted as I need to send a message to Slack to get manual approval that someone needs to click, okay, this build still makes it to the next stage or gets promoted or whatever the next action is, or not. And all of the values that are higher than 10%, so greater or equal to 440 milliseconds, fail. So while the theoretical description is somewhat hard to understand, I hope this example is easy to follow.
So you want to move away from defining lower and upper bounds and just assume that that number goes bidirectional? Meaning it's really plus or minus 5% when you say 5%, as opposed to like, because before we used to say lower threshold and upper threshold, which kind of gives you the flexibility to make them different. But this sounds like this is, you have one number and it defines, the range.
That's a real interesting question, actually. So do you also want to be notified if the response time or request latency drops more than 20%?
Yeah, I think it depends on the metric. You have certain metrics where you have a certain boundary that you want to be within, and you have certain metrics that you only want to be alerted if they go up, or certain metrics that you only want to be alerted if they go down. I think that's right. Rob is straight on here. That's also why in the previous implementation we had the upper and lower CV and warning.
We can work
it
that
is an
in
extra
here.
line to enter in, but and I can't think of a metric off the top of my head, but I would think if you had the flexibility to put the upper and lower, even though you might make them the same most of the time, it gives you kind of that flexibility, which,
Or, I mean, like we talked about this also, why not just properly define this with a lower than equals or greater than equals sign and bool comparison or something like that. So it would be pass lower than 5% means everything that's lower than 5%, and you can clearly read what's written there. So because right now, and that was one of my critics in the last time I reviewed this document, you only see pass 5% and needs approval 10%. This is completely out of context. You don't know if it means 5% plus and 5% minus, or if it's just always 5% plus, and if it's less, it's always okay. So if you use a proper query language here as a definition, I think it would be beneficial. But it's obviously more implementation to be done.
Right. And I also think like needs approval. I mean, just a thought. I mean, I like the idea of having something that indicates that, but I guess I kind of liked how we had it before too, where it was like pass, or it's like warning. There's a warning, and then maybe the warning, maybe that's just a different flag, like, like you have pass, warning, fail definitions, and then there's sort of like a fourth option, warning needs approval, yes or no, or something like that. Versus actually labeling it needs approval, because I don't think, that's going to be every scenario. Someone needs to have an approval other than just it's a warning.
That's a valid point.
Yeah, this is Jürgen. Hi. Following the discussion here, I also think it would be great to have like a lower and upper bound, because if the, for example, response time like is suspiciously better than before, then Keptn could warn because maybe there's some functionality missing, or like if the response time was 100 milliseconds before and now it's only 20, it might be that some in the refactoring went wrong. So Keptn could detect this, and with the current proposal, I think that would not be possible.
That is true.
Right. And I do think, now this may be a future, but since we're just throwing things out, in a scenario like I mean, there's some metrics that may want a fixed number, right? And like, say, exceptions, right? I may want it to be like an absolute number. Like, I don't want to see more than 3 exceptions. I'm making that up.
Yeah.
Versus a percentage comparison. So I don't know if the flexibility will be in there to kind of say, these metrics I kind of do as a percentage comparison, where, you know, and then maybe there's still onesie two in there that are like, that want a fixed threshold because it's just appropriate to be like a fixed threshold.
That's coming back to the comparison strategy we had before, I guess. So the 5 SLIs we chose initially work well with percentages. So if you want exceptions, then you would also need to have a comparison strategy that compares against fixed thresholds, right?
Right. But so maybe the strategy should be at the objective level, not the overall SLO file level. I mean, I don't know how it internally processes things, but if it's evaluating each metric anyway by itself, then why not make it, you know, at the you know, the metric level?
Yeah, we can think about that. So would any of the people that actually were now participated in the discussion, would they like to come up with a reworked or revised version of that with the lower and upper severe boundaries?
Yeah, I think Rob and I can take a stab at this because we are the ones that are currently using it heavily. And exactly.
Yeah, we can make a little draft, sure. And then Jürgen, I mean, obviously you know, obviously the whole team here can weigh in on that, but sure.
Sure. So I think you have the document that you have edit or at least comment rights, and if not, just reach out to me.
Okay.
But it's a good discussion, and I really like the way that this meeting actually goes. So it's only partially me like reading the document, but then actually people weigh in and just share their opinions, and yeah, I really liked it. It's good. Okay, objectives. Let's for the sake of simplicity and for the rest of the document, let's just go with this version. Otherwise, it's going to get too complicated. Now we're through with objectives, indicators, and how the configuration of objectives work. And now I would like to walk you through, we have 24 minutes left, to what the user would need to do to actually make use of Keptn quality gates. So as we said before, a prerequisite is a running Keptn installation. So you would need to create a project, of course, with a specific name. And you, as usual, provide a shipyard file. So since you might use your existing tools for deployment and testing, it might not be necessary to define deployment or testing strategies. So a simple shipyard file that just has one stage with a name might be sufficient for this use case. And after creating the project, and then again, here we are in the this is how it's going to work pretty soon. You would need to apply a uniform. So if you install Keptn right now, the batteries included services are installed during the installation process. Then again, if you would want to change the services that are configured for specific events, you could adapt the YAML file and use different services instead by just applying that YAML file again. And if I say technically wrong things, please correct me for all of the core maintainers that are in the call. And in fact, once we have that flexibility of exchanging the services that are automatically installed, you can also specify only one service, for example, or only two services that listen to specific events. So in case of the Keptn Quality Gates use case, the start deployment and start tests event don't necessarily need a service that are capable of actually deploying or executing tests. So in this example, for those events, we came up with a no-op service that does nothing, but we're still want to have the traceability of the entire application delivery workflow. So if you send Keptn a start deployment event, you send all of the information you usually would send to Keptn, and we have it. And we can use it later on also as a reference for other tasks, and we can visualize it in the bridge. And same goes for the evaluation service that, of course, listens to the event start evaluation. And in the uniform file, there is also the SLI provider that is configured. So as said before, in the initial version, we will support Prometheus and Dynatrace, and you can provide an endpoint and, if needed, an API token. And right now we will implement this via adding a secret and then referencing that secret in the uniform YAML in the configuration. All right. Then you would need to create a Keptn service for each project, for each service that you want to evaluate using Keptn Quality Gates. So Keptn creates service name, and for the specific project that you like. Usually you would, as in the onboarding use case, you would provide a Helm chart, but then again, there is no deployment done by Keptn, so there is no need for a Helm chart. But what we need at a service level is the SLO file, the service level objective file we saw in the previous section. And you can add that file using the add resource command we added with the latest Keptn version.
I would now have a question. Sorry?
Sorry.
I would now have a question regarding this section. So who is sending the start deployment events? So initially, or up to now, always Keptn sends these events, but who is now sending this?
We will come exactly to that in the next section.
Perfect.
So maybe I got ahead of myself a little bit while talking about it, but this is like the setup steps that are necessary to do it. And then during the execution of a deployment and tests and evaluation, this is what you need to do during that time. So this is once before you want to run anything. And this is how evaluating a service with Keptn Quality Gate works. And there is also already the answer to your question. So let's say the example could be that you have a Jenkins pipeline or a Bamboo pipeline that actually takes care of deploying your artifacts and running your tests. In order to have the entire application delivery workflow visible and also traceable in Keptn, you would need to extend the pipeline files with the Keptn specific commands that inform Keptn of the deployment and the test events. And here's why this is actually useful and helps you later on. So for example, in your Jenkins pipeline, make sure you have the Keptn CLI installed and proper configured, and then send us a deployment event before you actually deploy the artifact. So in here, this could be like a Jenkins pipeline that then says kubectl apply -f something something. And you just inform Keptn that a deployment is about to happen. So we have the information and also the Keptn context. And after the deployment is done, so the kubectl command returned successfully, you can inform Keptn that the deployment is done. And to that end, if you, for example, have a Dynatrace service configured, then you would already again have the correct events attached to the entities that that are affected by this deployment.
I would have kept, sorry for interrupting, I would have a question here. So how is this different from the Keptn send event new artifact? Because with Keptn send event new artifact, you don't get the Keptn context back from the CLI. And in this case, you would get the Keptn context back, and you can use it further on in all subsequent comments.
Yeah. So the main difference is that Keptn does no deployment. So we can't say if a deployment is done or not. So we don't have the since we don't trigger, since Keptn doesn't trigger the deployment, we have no way of knowing when a deployment is successful or done or not. So we need that information. So we need someone else telling us that it's done, because we simply don't know it.
So basically the steps you see here would be the steps that Keptn would do if you create a new artifact, but Keptn would also do the step of testing within Keptn with JMeter and whatever. But right now you're responsible to do the deployment and the testing with this new approach.
Get it. Then, since I was not part of all the discussions before, and it's like more or less my first look at this document, so my thought would be here that Keptn start deployment sounds very much for me that Keptn should do something, because you tell Keptn start deployment, and Keptn send new artifact, send event new artifact does not sound like Keptn should do something, but it's actually the complete opposite, because in the one hand, we want just Keptn to inform, and on the other side, we trigger a whole workflow in Keptn.
So I totally agree.
Think about.
Yeah, we had that in our in previous discussion when I was drafting this document, and I got the same feedback. I just have not updated the specification yet, but it's totally agree. Yes,
you could do something like a Keptn notify deployment,
exactly.
Keptn notify tests. Yeah,
I mean,
yes,
I think, I don't know. I think when some tool is going to integrate in with Keptn, like say Jenkins, it just seems overly complicated. I mean, usually I run my test right in Jenkins. I say evaluate result, and in sync, basically synchronously within that pipeline, I'm going to expect an answer back. And that was kind of where I just think of the simple call, like I make a REST call, I make it makes a post, and I get an answer back like instantaneously, more or less. But all of the stuff you're describing here just seems like more complicated than I guess I was envisioning it to be. Just like I make a REST call, evaluate my results, get my answer back, move on. But
while that is true that there are more commands necessary, you also get more of it out of it later on. So you get the entire visualization, you get the results stored in Keptn, you have all of the benefits that as if you would use Keptn to actually run your deployments and your tests. And here we come to the important next step where you actually say, and translating on the fly, Keptn notify I'm starting tests for a specific project, stage name in a service, and once the tests are through, you can send a done event again. We automatically know the start time and the end time of the test, so we know the time frame when the test has happened, and can use that time frame in the evaluation implicitly later on. So you don't need to specify the start time or the duration of the time or a stop time later on, because we already know. So while I agree with you that having 4 commands less might be easier, I still think that the 4 commands won't make the difference for anyone that implements Keptn in their pipelines for doing that. So if they can implement this command, I think they can also implement the other 4. And by that, get the full visibility in the Keptn's bridge and all of the other advantages I just mentioned.
And Rob, maybe I want to give you some additional thoughts here. I think this is a great opportunity for us to build a little Jenkins library or a Jenkins plugin that basically provides a single convenient function if you really just want to say, Keptn, evaluate the last 10 minutes. And then what it does internally exactly this here.
But
right, that's what I was thinking too, like some sort of wrapper. And I don't know if that would be easier to, I mean, I know this is all like the CLI flavor here, but you know, some of these tools want to make the REST call, I'm sure, as opposed to the CLI.
Yeah, that will also work. So
that'll all come to, yeah.
And this is basically just an implementation of the, is it shift left or shift right? I always mix those two up, but it's basically providing more information at the very early level to have that information later on.
No, I understand. So it's just a matter of how people may expect to call it. I think something like, I may want to provide my own start-stop times, right, as part of one call. You know, I may want to, like, I know when I talked to Neotis, their start-stop times are embedded within their testing tool. So all they're going to know is I called the test tool test run number 4. And part of their work, they're going to go get the start-stop times out of the test tool, because the test execution times are not stored. They don't know it because it's stored in the testing tool.
But this is a perfect example with Neoload again. So if you need additional context information to a third-party service, you can embed that, for example, in the event that you send during start tests, where you just add this additional context information in the data block of the event. And then you have that information when you start the evaluation. You already have the test run ID, and you don't need to basically come up with snowflake implementations of the start evaluation command for every individual third-party service that is out there. You just tell them, if you need additional context information, send it in the event before, because when you start the evaluation, you will have it available in the event. You know?
But it sounds like I have to be aware of the Keptn context, though. It sounds like, you know, like I'm just looking at all the commands on your screen. I mean, as I'm having to keep track of that Keptn context within my pipeline tool, so that I can then later pass that back in. Is that right?
Sure. So if you say so this is the first time you interact with Keptn following this example. So this command would most likely return a Keptn context that you have a reference to that unique flow, application delivery flow, you know. And then, of course, I mean, the most pipeline tools I know can save variables, and you can use them later on pretty easily. So I don't think that this would be much of a problem. But if you think otherwise.
No, I mean, I guess I don't think so. I guess I have to absorb this, right? I guess I'm just, to keep going, because I know we only have 10 minutes. I would just say keep going.
Yeah. Then again, it's a holiday in the US.
No, I'm just, yeah, no, I'm just trying to think of the scenario, and I just don't want us to get boxed into, like, you can only use Keptn one way, you know, or these quality gates one way. Like, you have to run a pipeline in a very specific way, or it's not going to work. That's, and I just need time to kind of think through it and read through the document a little bit more. But so
okay. One last question regarding this triggers or these commands or these events which you tell Keptn. So are these events necessary so that we started the deployment?
It depends on your needs. So as I said before, you get something out of it. So you get the visualization and you get the entire application delivery flow in the Keptn's bridge. And if you really want to pass in additional context information, then maybe the answer is yes, you need that, because otherwise you would have no possibility to pass additional context information to the evaluation service and the specific plugin that pulls the SLIs that maybe needs that context information. If you don't need any of that, then the answer is maybe you can work without it. But then again, we actually want to introduce the concepts of Keptn, that it's an control plane for your application delivery and continuous operations flow workflow. So and just introduce also the concepts that we follow. So when we really want someone to start using Keptn, we want to introduce the concepts in a way that they understand that it makes sense to use it that way. Because what is the logical consequence if someone starts to send those start deployment events in his Jenkins pipelines? So, I mean, the first thought that comes to mind is, okay, so if I turn this around and just send the events that I want to start a new deployment to Keptn, and Keptn can start this pipeline, then I don't need to send the events. And I by accident get a control plane that I can talk to various services out of the box without me needing to write any additional code within my pipelines. And this is actually the discussion that we want to have with people using Keptn. And that's kind of the direction we want them to go. I'm not sure if I make
Thank you.
my
I
point.
got it. But
okay,
probably we can make this more explicit when we add something like a custom deployment in the shipyard. But I haven't thought lots about this. Let's continue now. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 6 minutes left. So we sent the meta information or the metadata about the deployment and the test. And now the actual evaluation of the Keptn quality gates can start. So now you can just say start evaluation. And this time I think start is actually true, because we want Keptn to really start the evaluation, while in these two cases it's more than a notification than really a command to start something. And we provide the project and the service name. And we can, by the information we got before, automatically retrieve the correct service level objectives file. We have the service level indicator provider configured in the uniform YAML, can query the SLIs and compare them to the SLOs and store the results within Keptn. And this command also returns the Keptn context, which can then later on be used for retrieving the evaluation results. And this is actually the way that most of the people we talk to were comfortable with. So sending an asynchronous command of a start evaluation and then just polling for the results. While a synchronous call would be maybe more comfortable from a user's point of view, this is actually what we got as a feedback that also works well for people who want to work with Keptn in that use case.
And it's coming back to the same discussion from earlier, we can always write helper functions for the individual tools out there.
Exactly.
And basically build this in here.
Then again, coming back to many points we had already, this is the MVP.
Mm-hmm.
If we later on find that there is the need for a synchronous version of this, yeah, why not? We can build it. And the result that you would get back is similar to the cloud event we already have, the evaluation done event, where you get like the indicator results with all of the indicators, the SLIs in that case, violations and results. Now we have 4 minutes left.
I think I think this is a great start, and I think the action items, Rob and I will come up with a new different, let's say, sample SLO file to cover the things we said earlier, right? I think that's great. And then if you can really change the CLI comments to make it more, to make it easier to understand what it really is, if we do a notify, I think that's a great start already. And then the question, I think the other one that I have, when can we expect the first MVP?
Who didn't want to do that? Action items.
So we will provide a sample SLO file that includes the upper and lower boundaries, also the static thresholds, just so we basically the use cases that we believe should be in the MVP.
Mm-hmm. Will you two be able to do that until the next community meeting?
Yeah, we'll do this soon. I think next day or two.
So Dirk, this is Peter. I had a quick
Pete.
follow-up question because I did have to go off for about a second or two as I went through security. But quick question on this is this all going to be within a Kubernetes framework only, or is there quality gates going to be available outside of Kubernetes?
Mm-hmm. As of now, we're still bound to Kubernetes as a runtime for Keptn.
Okay. And then a follow-up on that would be as far as additional, because I know we had talked earlier with Henrik about, you had mentioned earlier about Henrik looking for additional sources. When will we be able to have information about how to implement additional sources?
I think we can cover that topic in the next community meeting.
Perfect. Okay, great.
Stop you. No.
Just to add about the running within Kubernetes or not, if I'm pretty sure there's going to be a Docker image of the evaluation service, and there might be a way that you can just run this Docker image out of the box without Kubernetes runtime. It's not just the preferred and supported way, but I'm pretty sure it would be possible to figure out.
Yeah, but then again, this leaves out the entire magic that Keptn brings to the table, and this is so we really want people to have the entire Keptn experience with the bridge, with all the events that actually are the foundation of the way that Keptn works. So, but what we actually will come up with eventually is, and this is now the last minute of the meeting, is we are researching ways to have an on-premise standalone version of Keptn without needing Kubernetes. But this is a research task, and don't expect anything in that direction in the next, I don't know, 3 or 4 months, somewhere down the road. Information on how to write SLI providers. Was it right, Pete?
Yeah, exactly. And I assume then the idea would be not to have it like a mini cube or something, but rather have it entirely as its own.
Yes, no mini cube. All right, so we're on top of the hour. Thanks everyone for joining. If you have any points you want to follow up later on, either leave comments in the document or reach out to the Keptn team in the Slack channel. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.